Lecture 3 on variables. It's all part of the scientific method. So you're doing a good experiment between whether styrofoam or rubber or nothing at all is a better insulator. Will it keep a drink hot or cold? So insulator means like you keep the heat inside. So for a hot drink. And describe how you set up your experiment, be specific. So that's the sample idea to get us started. The idea is when you set up an experiment, you probably would like, if you're gonna test the insulator, like a rubber cup, a paper cup, and a glass cup. You have these 3 cups, right? That'll be our experiment. Now, the experimental group is what we're testing, and the control group is the subject that there's no change in the experiment. So you have your glass, you have your paper, and you have a rubber cup, and you pour hot water in it, and you see what happens. And you check the temperature. And the rubber cup and the paper cup would be your experimental cups. Is the paper better or the rubber better? The glass cup, glass is not insulator, so it will just like let the heat out. So that's our control. Now, let's go to another experiment and we'll come back to the insulator experiment again. So this is an example. For first example, Joey thinks that ocean water exposed to a lot of sunlight will have more salinity. Salinity is a measurement of salt. He decides to run an experiment by taking 2 samples of ocean water and leaving one in the sun while the other stays out of the sun. He measures the salinity over 2 weeks. So the experimental group is a sample in the sun. The control group is a sample in the shade. Why? You're changing the temperature with the sun, and that would see if there's any effect with the sun on the water. The control group, the one you compare it to, will be a sample in the shade. So there's no sunlight and there's no change in temperature. You see what happens. You need a comparison between 2 groups whenever you do an experiment. Example 2. You have dolphins around Hawaii who reside in warmer water. They tend to have more offspring. Does water temperature have an effect on the fertility of dolphins? Fertility is whether they will have babies or not. So the experimental group is dolphins in warm water. The control group is dolphins in average temperate water. So you just have these 2 dolphins and you see what happens. Will they have more babies or not? There are other factors true, but we're testing out this one factor. So whenever you have a control variable, what remains the same for each cup? So we had a paper cup, a glass cup, and a rubber cup. What would happen if each cup had different surroundings or settings? So the variable does not change in an experiment. That remains accurate. That's called a constant. Be careful. In science, a constant means it doesn't change. In mathematics, a constant is a number. So you have a paper cup, a glass cup, and a rubber cup. The glass cup will be controlled to see how much heat's lost, and you'll see if the paper cup holds heat more or the rubber cup holds heat more. And that's what you do right there. That's how you do it. And you would have all the same surroundings, be on a table, everything would be the same. That way you can compare them. Here's another example of a comparison. 2 famous wrestlers back in time. The Rock is Dwayne Johnson, movie star now. Hulk Hogan was also very famous. And they're both out of shape and they want to get their muscles back. So Hogan thinks that eating a lot of carbs, bread, starches, rice will build him up. But The Rock says it doesn't matter what Hogan thinks, you need to eat meat to bulk up. Hogan and Rock decide to run an experiment. They both work out the same, but Hogan will eat carbs, breads, rice, cereals, while The Rock eats meat to see who is bigger faster. So all these other things come into play, right? Like if Hulk Hogan works out 10 days in a row and The Rock works out only 3, that changes things. So they have to work out the same amount of times. What kind of exercise they do? They have to do the same exercises. How much of the other food groups do they eat? They have to eat the same amount of the other food groups. But the focus is Hulk Hogan will eat carbs, The Rock will eat meat. And you run the experiment. There's another example of running a different experiment. You see if eating breakfast makes a difference in performance at school. And there's all these different variables like sleep, how many classes, what's the routine, what kind of distractions happen, the attitude, the day of the experiment, amount of work. These things make a difference. Like, do you check Monday or do you check Friday? Do you check the morning class or the afternoon class? Do you make them sleep a certain time? So there's a lot of these different variables. And whenever you do comparison, you have to try to get everything on the same page so that the comparison works. So back to the beginning. In the experiment with insulator, you're testing the effect of different types of insulators on a hot drink. What variable do we change? We change the type of insulator material. Rubber, paper, glass. What variable did we observe? The temperature of the drink. That's the one thing that stays, that you're checking on all three. This brings us to the idea of independent and dependent variables. This is a very tough concept, so it's okay if you don't get the first time. The independent variable is the variable that you change, manipulate, or cause something to happen. The dependent variable is the variable that you observe or measure and the effect. Let's do an example to be more obvious. So, do plants need the sun in order to grow? What are the variables? The independent variable. We are going to change the amount of sunlight. Dependent variable will be what we're measuring, the plant growth. So, you take the independent variable and you say, we know exactly what we're going to do. It's a number. We're going to give the plants 2 hours of sunlight, and then we measure their plant growth. We don't know their growth. So one plant gets 2 hours, one plant gets 4 hours, and you see which one gets better growth. So the independent variable doesn't rely on anything else. It's the cause. And then we see what the effect is. What happens to the dependent variable? Plant growth. Very difficult concept. So here, you have rain and zebras. A scientist wants to study the relationship between the amount of rain and the number of zebras born each spring. So all he does is he looks at the amount of rain and the number of zebras. The independent variable is the amount of rain. Can't control how much rain is coming. Just got to measure it. And then you measure the number of zebras and you assume they're linked together. Then you write prediction. If your independent variable does this, then the dependent variable does this because. So if you give the plant 4 hours of sunlight, the plant will grow because it needs at least 4 hours of sunlight to grow. So, do plants need the sun in order to grow? What are the variables? Sunlight, dependent variable, plant. So, if there's an absence of sunlight, then the plants will not grow because plants need sunlight to grow. So, you will do an experiment where you give plants no sunlight, give plants 4 hours of sunlight, give plants 8 hours of sunlight, and see what happens to each plant. So, the components of any experiment is an independent variable where you change the amount of time it's in the sun, you set some marker, you determine the independent variable. The dependent variable is what will change based on your independent variable. You change the amount of sunlight, you don't know how much the plant will grow. You don't know if it'll grow at all. You have an experimental group where you change something and you have a control group to compare it to. You have a rubber cup, a paper cup, and a glass cup. The control is the glass cup. You'll see the temperature of the glass cup and compare it to the paper cup and the rubber cup. And these controls, and you control all the outside variables. The Hulk Hogan experiment, you try to control how often they work out and what they eat. But Hulk gets more carbs and The Rock gets more meat.